So let's go ahead and let me just introduce our panelists today and let me spotlight them. And here we have, okay, you see in the corner, Surya here. Surya is a capture specialist at Emergent Biosolutions. For some of you who haven't seen their bios, Surya has received his PhD in molecular and cellular biology from the University of Maryland. And then he did a very short postdoc. So we'll talk about the length of that postdoc, Surya, in a bit, because a lot of postdocs are on this call as well. And currently you work in the external development group to facilitate communication with stakeholders and develop strategies to secure non-dilutive funding. And I want to know what that all means because I have no idea. And then Damini is our JHU alum. Thank you for joining in. Thank you to Dora for introducing us as well. She's the Director of Product Development, Infinite Biomedical Technologies, and it's a medical device company. So are you in Baltimore now, Damini? Okay, so she's in Baltimore and she graduated with a master's degree in biomedical engineering. And some of you on this call are from biomedical engineering field as well. Please make sure that you mute your microphones as well. So Damini currently works with very cool stuff, actually, amputees and developing next-gen technology for prosthetics. And we'll talk about the highlights of her job as well. And Jessica and I have known each other a long time. We were in the trenches together at grad school, same PhD lab. And Jessica is a senior scientist at a biotech startup company, Kytopen, is that how I pronounce it, Jessica? And so we'll talk about startup culture with Jessica as well. She got her postdoc at Harvard, and she believes in mentorship. She's on science outreach. She's active on Twitter. So if you want to follow Jessica, and actually all our participants, panelists are on Twitter. So please make sure you follow them as well. So let's begin. That was a brief overview. Let's dive right into it. So let me ask you to take us back to that moment where you were considering leaving the academic world and transitioning into industry. Let's start with you, Surya. What was your mindset like? How were you sort of exploring various career paths at that moment in either your postdoc or your grad school?
Okay, hi everyone. So I had decided to leave academia, I think, shortly when I started my postdoc. I was sort of under the impression that my postdoc would be very different than my PhD research, and it really wasn't, and it wasn't really fulfilling what I wanted to do in my career. And so basically my first step was to figure out what else is out there, which is kind of what you guys are doing today. So I attended a lot of career panels, did a lot of networking sessions just to figure out where my interests might lie. And then from there, I reached out to people who were working in the field to learn more about the different areas that my PhD training could be useful. And that's how I ended up in the position I'm today.
Okay, and Jessica, you were in Harvard, and if I remember correctly, your ambitions at that point were to go into academia. Can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to move from a lab in Harvard to a startup company in Boston?
Yeah, definitely. So that is correct. You remembered correctly. I did have aspirations to stay in the academic realm. But what I found is that what I loved about what I was doing and the parts of it that I had stronger negative feelings towards were diverging. And so what I thought I loved about academics were actually things that I loved that could be applied to other jobs, like in biotech or in industry. And so as I got a clearer picture of what parts of my scientific career actually made me feel happy to come to work every day, those are the ones I started leaning in on. So mentoring was something I thought I could only do in academics. And then once I realized there were some opportunities to continue mentoring outside of that, it kind of freed me up a little bit to move forward from there. But I will agree, networking was vital to that, being able to talk to other people that had gone into startups or to people that had started brand new career paths as assistant professors, just kind of to get a feel for what their life was like, really did help me decide which direction I wanted to go.
Okay, and Damini, did you actually end up doing any internships? How did you make that decision? And were you on a special visa because you were international by any chance? So can you talk to us a little bit about your experience as well?
Sure, absolutely. So I did do internships while I was doing my master's. In fact, my internship was with the company that I'm working at right now. And I was in a unique situation, I think, when I was doing my master's, because the lab that I was doing my thesis with worked very closely with the company that I work at now for joint NIH SBIR funding. As a result of which, my master's thesis uh, well, I did, the proof of concept of research through my master's thesis, and then my company was going to commercialize that technology further, irrespective of, whether I continue with academia or industry. And I think that was the decision point for me to, choose between doing a PhD versus, going into industry. Is since I was already so fond of my project and I'd seen the research aspect of it, this was a good opportunity for me to see how commercialization of research technology takes place through industry. And that was, I think, the primary decision in going forward with an industrial career before an academic career.
Damini, since you have the mic last, I just want to ask, what was your career transition like? Did you enter becoming the director of that in that company, or how did that work?
So that's a good question. I actually started out, as I mentioned, as a research intern through my master's program, and then I joined as a full-time employee as a biomedical engineer. I then became product manager of our entire product suite. And then I, grew into the director of product development position, where I have a lot more oversight over a lot more different divisions in the company now.
Okay, awesome. I think we're all eager to know, and as I mentioned earlier, Surya, what do you do? Like, what is your title entail? Can you describe how your day-to-day work looks like in the company?
Yeah, so it took me a while to learn also, since it's not research focused. But yeah, so essentially what happens is when you have a vaccine candidate or a therapeutic candidate, to get it to FDA licensure, right, you have to go through clinical trials and a lot of manufacturing. So since that takes a lot of money, it's not something that can be internally funded by the company for every single program. So because of that, what we do in our group is basically find funding sources for these particular programs. So managing stakeholders is really reaching out to agencies or nonprofit groups or something like the Gates Foundation to see if they have interest in the products that we're developing. And then we develop a strategy to get them to convince them to essentially give us the money for the product development. And so that's really what our group is really in charge of. And so capture is just a small part of that whole overall process. So essentially what I do is develop actual strategy. So what are the sort of advantages of our candidate? What are the advantages of our business compared to other businesses, things like that.
Okay, Damini?
I'm sorry?
Your turn. In terms of your day-to-day, how does that look like as director of product development?
Gotcha. So there are, I think, three primary divisions that I oversee in the company. One is obviously product development. The second is quality and regulatory affairs, and the third is production and manufacturing. And I can give you, a little bit description about each of these different roles. So for product development, we have 4 commercially available technologies on the market, both a mix of, class 1 and class 2 FDA approved CE mark devices. So, I work with our engineering team to roll out feature updates, bug fixes, design changes to address, issues that we've been seeing with the devices. And in addition to that, also overseeing translation of research systems into, new products that are ready for commercialization. So that's, the primary engineering aspect of it. Obviously, because we're a medical devices company, we're regulated by the FDA, which means, we have strict guidelines, standards that we have to demonstrate compliance to. And I oversee, our regulatory pathway for new devices and ensure compliance with our quality and regulatory processes. And then we also do our final assembly in-house. So we have an on-site production and manufacturing section as well to our company. So I work with our production engineers as well as interns to make sure material inspection, assembly, final products, match the tech specs that we lay out for them before they're put on patients.
Okay. And Jessica, I'm sure you're a senior scientist. So you're also working in the laboratory now. Can you talk to us a little bit about who you work with and what does the team look like? Do you oversee any sort of junior scientists?
So right now we do have a small team. Our startup has 8 people, and that means that I get to wear a lot of hats. So I'm not just in the lab, I'm also in the meetings. I meet with collaborators. I try and build relationships with new people that we could start working with and try and build partnerships. So my day is probably split between writing, meaning like grants, as well as trying to put together white papers and abstracts to get the word out about our device, working in the lab on collaborator experiments as well as internal development, and then attending business meetings and trying to make sure that we stay on path with our scientific goals.
Okay, so a lot of hats as you described. But since you had the mic last, I want to ask you, in terms of startup versus big companies, how do you make that decision? What enticed you to sort of join a company of 8 people versus a huger number of people in the company?
Well, when I joined the company, it was actually just the 2 co-founders. So I was the very first hire in this company, which is a big leap of faith. But what drew me in is the fact that I could wear all the different hats, because I had been so focused on doing academics and I wasn't really sure how I would fit into the world of industry. Startup, I thought, was a really great opportunity for me to see where my my skill set would actually lead me and where I would find some strength. And so I thought by having these different opportunities, I would find my best fit in the company.
Okay. So what would you say are the advantages or disadvantages of working in a startup? And then I'll ask Damini how big, and Surya how big their companies are and how they see that's an advantage. So what are the pros and cons of working in a startup?
So for the startup, I think it's very engaging. Things are changing all the time. It's very dynamic. What I'm doing 1 month to the next could be as different as completely different cell types, completely different focuses. So that is much more interesting than I had initially thought industry would be. I thought I'd be a little bit more focused and it would be the same thing day in, day out. So I think that's one of the great parts about being in the startup. Now, one of the negatives is that because there are so many hats I wear, sometimes my focus gets pulled in too many directions. So trying to reset my brain as I'm running from one meeting to the next, or as I'm trying to get my hands washed in time to make it to a meeting, those sometimes can be hard transition points. So really trying to figure out how to balance those things can be a skill, a learned skill.
We actually had a submission from someone saying, how do you leverage your position in a startup? Like, you came straight from postdoc in Harvard into a startup. So what did you negotiate? What did you leverage? What did you sell basically about yourself?
So the company I was coming into was mostly engineers. We had an MIT professor who was an engineer, mechanical, and then my CEO had a little bit background in biology, but mostly engineering. So my biggest sell was immunology. I knew what it was. I've worked with those cells. I have a wealth of literature that I'm associated with and a big knowledge base. So I was able to take that and say, basically, I'm the missing piece to your puzzle. Like, I can help you guys in this big way. And I really took that on as a challenge.
Okay. And Damini, do you feel like working in a sort of bigger company, that how do you work yourself up to leadership positions? Do you feel seen? What are the advantages and disadvantages of bigger companies like yours?
So that's a good question. And honestly, like, IBD isn't very big either. So we are a 15-employee company, so it's similarly sized to Jessica's, but we've definitely been around for a while. So, there's a lot more maturity in the structure that exists. And I think primarily, I think some of the pros and cons, working for a company like this is, as Jessica mentioned, you get to learn a lot just because, there's so much happening. It's all hands on deck, most of the time. So it's a great learning experience. If you're trying to understand what the industry looks like, then, I would recommend join a smaller company, because it'll give you a lot of different tastes of all the roles that exist. But, a lot of people don't enjoy that. And, especially because, your schedule can be pretty chaotic. So, I usually don't know what my day is going to look like until it has happened, just because, there's so much going on. And oftentimes, if you're trying to improve, if you're decided that, there's a specific technical skill set that you really enjoy and you want to continue working on that and improving on that, then I think, larger companies have more defined roles that allow you to excel in those positions. And with regards to rising through the organization, I think it primarily, for a mid-sized company like ours that's been around for a while, it depends on how hard you work and, how much effort you're putting in, whether you're going out of your way, whether you're taking initiative. Those are, I think, some of the key things that, set you apart from your peers and, help you grow quickly.
And Damini, you were an international person. Were you an OPT and then moved on to what kind of visa?
That is correct. So I was on an F1 through my master's. I did my internship on a CPT. I then was on an OPT for a few years, went on to STEM extension, and then I'm now on an H1B.
H-1B. Okay, so the company sponsored that H-1B
That's
for
correct.
you. So Jessica, there was a question from the audience that says, in startup companies, are you aware of those that hire international students after grad school or postdocs?
I know that it's possible. A lot of our job opportunities that have gone out for Kaidopen have been focused on the local area, and that's just because of bandwidth. We can't afford to fly people in for job opportunities and to look at 100 different applicants from all over the country. So yes. I would say that that's an unfortunate part of startups, is that they don't have the ability to absorb some of those costs.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of the startups that I work with at the incubator space where we're housed do have international students that are there as either interns or for part-time and full-time employment.
What about the era of COVID? Surya, are you seeing, what do you foresee as being the future of hiring in the biotech industry post-COVID as well, or during this COVID era?
So I would say, our company works very heavily in the infectious disease space. So for us, this is actually an incredibly busy time. And so I'd say there is a lot of jobs, and I think there's also increased awareness, I think, on the globe that we're underprepared from an infectious disease standpoint. And so there are a lot of organizations and government agencies that are looking basically to fund new products in order to treat this a lot of the infectious disease that are probably going to come down in the future as well. So I'd say if that's really in your background, there are a lot of opportunities that are going to be available, both on research, manufacturing, but also on the business development side.
Okay. And do you feel like in a startup, there's the possibility of increased doubts about your job security because it's a startup, it's a small company? Or how do you sort of categorize job security in a startup versus a bigger company, or even Damini-sized company, which is about 15 people? How are you feeling about job security? And that was a question in the audience.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think it ultimately boils down to what the source of funding for the company is. You know, are you a venture-backed firm? Are you a government grant-sponsored firm? Obviously, government grant funding, doesn't dry out overnight. So there's likely going to be a lot more stability if you're actively funded by NIH, NSF, DoD departments. Obviously, volatility with venture-backed funding is more. But I think what you need to use as a metric for stability is how long the company's been around. So, if it's less than 5 years, then, the risk of the company going down is higher. But, once you've reached the 5 to 10 years phase, you have one product out in the market, then the likelihood that things are going to generally continue on pace is fairly high. So, I would say if you're trying to build a career on the basis of, a startup surviving, don't do that. Use this as an experience and be open to the idea that, things might not work out the way you imagined it, and you should be able to pivot.
Okay. Surya, I want to get into the meat of the stock, and I want to ask you about your actual transition process. Can you tell me your brief overview? You were a postdoc, you did a 6-month postdoc. Did you find that postdoc was essential for you to do to move into your current role? And then tell us a little bit about how you applied, how many jobs you applied for. What about rejections? We want to know all that. So let's start off with 6-month postdoc.
Yeah, so I actually did 2 postdocs. I did a short 6-month postdoc, and then I did a 2-year postdoc at the NIH. And so the 6-month postdoc was really, I hadn't found where I wanted to go next after my thesis defense. Mm-hmm. And so someone on my committee had actually had a good opportunity to work on a DoD project for 6 months. And so I used that as an opportunity to find sort of what my next step was. And then I did a 2-year postdoc at the NIH. And I would say it was incredibly valuable for sure. Even though I'm not doing research in my role now, a lot of what I learned from a subject matter perspective, I use every day. And even my NIH lab, I was actually the first person to join. So it was under a new investigator. So it was a lot of, opening boxes, putting a lab together. And so all of those sort of soft skills that go along with it are things that I use every day as well. So in terms of how many jobs I applied to, I definitely applied to a handful. But I would say, I think when I first started right after my PhD, I kind of didn't know the smartest strategies for applying for jobs. So I would just go on either LinkedIn or Indeed and just apply to things sort of without tailoring my resume. Through my postdoc, I think I started doing a lot more of resume, writing classes and learning really how to network, because then you didn't have to apply to nearly as many jobs because your resume was a lot more tailored. You had a personal connection with the person you're applying to. So then at NIH, I only applied to, I think, 3 or 4 jobs before I got this one here, because I used those kinds of approaches. And so, yes, you do get rejections. It's kind of just the name of the game. Even if you think you fit sort of perfectly in a job descriptions, a lot of times job descriptions are written with someone in mind. So it's not really a reflection on you. You just have to you have to keep it moving and just not lose your confidence and stay patient.
Yeah, yeah. And someone asked a question here in the chat box too. When it comes to networking and reaching out to people, is there a particular way you suggest people do that? Like, how do you reach out for informational interviews? Do you contact people you know personally, or do you do it via like platforms such as LinkedIn or something like that? So let me ask Jessica first and then move on to Dan.
This is a great question. So cold calls are hard, right? To reach out to someone online and just say, hey, I've read about you and I'd love to talk. That can be difficult. But definitely just start leaning on people. You'd be amazed how many people in your already built community and network of people know someone. So even when I was in my postdoc and I was thinking about moving into industry, I started just talking about the fact that I was thinking in that direction. And I was amazed at how many people are like, well, I know someone who's at, I'm trying to think of the different ones, Shire. And so I was like, oh, well, Shire would be interesting. I'd like to see what that's about. And so instead of having that transition directly into me trying to get a job, what I actually did were informational interviews where I just wanted to talk to someone on the phone about what it was like to work in those labs, what those kinds of jobs actually entail. And you would be amazed at how much information you can get when you're not trying to get anything else out of it. When all you want to do is just talk to them about what their day is, people open up like crazy and they'll tell you all kinds of stuff. So I definitely recommend taking that approach. Just because you get the ability to get so much intel that way, rather than it being through HR, which can be a little bit more guarded. So definitely try to do that. But LinkedIn is great. Social medias can actually be really interesting places. Start looking at your second and third connections, not necessarily your primary ones, but who do you know that knows someone? And they can maybe say your name to that person and then start the conversation, or they can introduce you to someone on LinkedIn and start the conversation that way. Don't be afraid to reach out. I found that people really do want to help, and that's a super easy way to do it.
Yeah, and Damini, what would you say, give a piece of advice for those that are afraid that if I'm on LinkedIn, my advisor is going to know and they're going to sort of dissuade me from exploring careers outside of academics. So that's a query that people have. And any advice you could give us? Damini, you're muted.
I think it's very valid to have that fear, but a PI that genuinely cares about you and your progress is not going to hold you back. So that's the first thing. The next thing is that, you don't have to go around saying, as Jessica mentioned, leverage the fact that it's more of an information seeking activity rather than, recruiting activity, because, there's no harm in speaking to people, finding out your options, knowing what's out there. And, if the other thing is, have an honest conversation with your PI to let him know that, you are potentially thinking about maybe a transition, and what are the reasons why you're trying to do that. You'd be surprised how often PIs are very supportive and might even reach out into their network to help you out, in putting you in touch with other people.
Yeah. Surya, you're not doing any sort of, you said, the scientific bench work right now. We have a question from Vishal who's asking, in the biotech world, how essential is it to have a biology background from the start of your from your career? So different roles. Can you speak to the different roles besides the ones that are senior scientists or whatnot?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely useful. And I think so for like the work that I do, having that biology background allows me to be, I think, more efficient at my job for my particular role, just because you need to really have a good understanding of the products that you're trying to leverage. And so to do that, having a science background is definitely pretty important. I would say it really depends on sort of where in the industry you're trying to move to. So if you are trying to get more into the policy space or more into business development, it may not be as important. Yeah. Versus if you're trying to be a little bit more involved on the product side, I think it would be very important.
Yeah, and Jessica mentioned her founders, and the two founders, one was mechanical engineer and something else. So definitely there are there's a need for all sorts of people in the biotech world. Damini, in your experience, does one absolutely have to have a PhD? Because clearly you've moved on through the company with a master's. So would you recommend one go ahead and finish the postdoc, PhD? How important are those degrees as you move on through that world?
Right. So, and I think, that ties into what Surya said about, what kind of a job you're looking for. It's ultimately going to depend on, what your core skill set is and what kind of a job you're trying to match with. There are some obviously careers that require very highly specialized understanding of very specific areas. Obviously, in those cases, PhD, postdoc are instrumental in, supporting your skill set. While there might be other positions, with companies like mine where as long as you have a generally good specialization that you get by the end of masters, you can still do a good job at what you're being hired. So I think it's very custom. I don't think there's a one answer fit all solution to this. I think it highly depends on the kind of position you're trying to aspire to, and a good indication of whether you need a PhD or is a master's enough or is an undergrad degree enough is look at people's profiles that are doing the kind of work that you want to do and see what their qualifications are, and maybe chat with them and see how much that degree has helped them in their professional career, and that'll probably give you the most accurate picture of whether you need a postdoc or a master's or PhD.
Absolutely. Surya, I wanted to ask you, because this is a question that was submitted prior. Someone was wondering, I worked in a purely academic environment, and I don't think I have the transferable skills to make the transition into industry. Can you speak to what kind of skills we learn during our PhD that enable us to sort of have those transferable skills?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's one I had also when I was in an academic setting, because you feel like you're at the bench all day. What are you going to be able to do in front of a computer when your focus is a little different? One of the things I would say is you should sit and actually write down what is important for you to be in a lab and to do your research project. So one of the things that you'll learn really quickly is you do a lot of project management. You're very good at multitasking. And on top of that, you're very good at communicating with other people, because you're not only talking to other scientists all the time, but there are sales reps you have to talk to all the time, right? There are also conference organizers. There are your peers, there are the PIs, and then maybe the directors above them. So you have a lot more soft skills than you probably think you do. And so if you evaluate sort of what does it take for you to be successful in your position now as an academic, you'll realize that a lot of the skills that you're already building up are things that industry are looking for. Now, like you might not have the exact terminology and maybe the exact know-how of what a business pipeline works like or an industry pipeline works like, but those are things that you can learn. Because as a PhD or a master's student, it's all about learning. And so that's things that you've already sort of ingrained in yourself without even knowing.
So if you can demonstrate that you're able to learn even the new lingo, like I'm sure you didn't know regulatory lingo in the beginning, but because you have a PhD or a master's, you're able to learn, and you can learn quickly within the company as well. Now, do companies actually train you in the beginning on things that you may not be that familiar with?
For sure, yeah. So I had definitely a lot of training. I mean, you don't get too much time because you're kind of put on projects very quickly. So a lot of it was learning on the fly. But yeah, they're putting an investment by hiring you. And so they are going to put as much resources in your direction as you can in order for you to be successful.
Okay. And Jessica, you mentioned you reached out to a bunch of people, second degree connections, third degree connections. How do you Sarah has this question, how do you translate those things, the skills that you have as a PhD, into conversations during informational interviews or formal interviews and cover letters? Basically, I think Sarah's question is, how do you sell yourself when you're having those informational interviews, or what skills do you utilize to do so?
I think this is a great question. It's definitely one that I had when I was trying to convert like a CV into a resume. What does that look like? Because those are very different documents. So one of the things I realized is the way I thought about it before was very lab centric. So for instance, I've done a lot of animal work in my science career. And so I had been on a lot of things like animal care committees. I had worked with the regulatory branches to make sure that everyone was being safe. I'd been lab safety officer. All those things from a lab perspective just look like skills, but whenever, small skills, but whenever you think about that in the sense of a biotech company or something like that, those are much bigger skills. It means that you can't just interact with one person, you can interact with a room full of people. So how do you navigate that? So by changing the thought process, how would I want someone to look at this thing that I know how to do if they only lived in the business world. So someone from business thinks, okay, lab safety officer, what does that person do? So if you break it down in your head that way and you think, well, I deal with forms, I deal with safety, I deal with regulatory things, and I keep to a schedule. Those are things that every company needs. You just need to find the way to say those things into this more interesting way for the HR person or for the person that's doing the hiring and the interviews. So I think if you can step back from it a little bit, kind of take that bigger perspective back and just look at it from what would a business person describe this job as, or how would a CEO explain this, then that kind of gives you the distance to look at it with fresh eyes, because that is hard. We get very stuck in our day-to-day, and we can only see what we're doing each day, and it's hard to look forward like that. So that definitely took some trying. I got giggled at whenever I took my CV to resume first attempt to the postdoc office, which there's usually really great opportunities in whatever graduate or postdoc department you're in. There's usually at least one person that can help you with this, and don't be afraid to go to those things and to sit through it and to struggle with it. It's normal. It's part of everyone's process. And when you get to the other side, I actually went back to that department and showed them, like, hey, this is the resume that you helped me with, and it got me a job. They were very excited. Those are good moments for everyone.
Absolutely. There are folks, example, the PDCO and futures that can actually help you tailor your resume or think strategically about how you can apply. And that brings me to the question of, when do I start asking questions? When do I go on these informational interviews? 2 months away from the job or graduation, a year or two before, when I'm in my first year? When do you recommend is a good time to start these informational interviews? Let's go with Damini first.
So I would say that, again, it's very specific and custom, but, the more information you have the early on, the smarter decisions you can make. So, if you, I would say for master's students especially, the minute you start your degree, that's when your job search starts at the same time, because you're only in a 2-year program or sometimes even in a 1-year program. And you need to utilize every second of that time to build that network and relationships and, get all the information you need, so that by the time companies are hiring, you know what you want to do or where you want to go, right? So I would say that, for undergrads, I would say usually 2 years before you want to start a job or want to get into industry is usually good enough time to get, generally broad picture about what are the opportunities, how do you need to go about with it, what are the different strategies you need to use. So that's usually a good time frame.
Yeah, and Surya, what about if you're, in your postdoc or first year of your postdoc? Do you look in the last minute? Do you look early on? When would you suggest one looks?
I would say you start looking right away. And I know it's hard when you're just a postdoc, you've just transitioned and now you're kind of starting your project, but you don't want to start late, because it takes time, like Dominique said, right? It takes about 1.5 years, 2 years sometimes to figure out what you want to do and to figure out where you're going to end up fitting in. Yeah. So start right away. Don't wait until the last minute.
Yeah, and especially if you're international, you so many visa restrictions, and so you want to think ahead as well. So there are so many people applying for the same jobs with the same amount of skill set when it comes to research. So the question here is, how do I stand out in the application process when everyone else who's applying also has a similar background to mine? So Jessica, any tips for how you could do that?
I think this is where your soft skills actually stand out the most. So if everybody says, hey, I've got 5 publications and I've been doing research for 3+ years, that might sound like it doesn't build you up in the way that you need it to. But if you can show that you led collaborations, that you manage groups of students, things like that, that also are extremely necessary, but not everybody does. So the lab next door might be able to churn out papers, but all those people are just staring at their bench all day long. If you've been on any committees, if you've been in part of any student groups, these are all moments that shine and show who you are. And in the biotech startup environment, culture is very important, making sure that you fit. In a group of 8 people all sitting at one table together to get through the day and get through these meetings and push our product forward, we all have to get along and we all have to build on each other and on each other's skill set. So anything that can prove that you're a team player, that you're able to be innovative, that's a really big word in the biotech sphere. Anything that can prove that you came up with a novel idea, that you took initiative and you pushed a new idea forward, maybe something that your PI wasn't super interested in, but you were, and you made it happen. That's a huge, huge thing for people. They really like to see that kind of go get itness. So I would definitely lean on those kinds of things.
Okay. Any other additional comments to stand out from the rest of the panelists? Surya and Damini, feel free.
No, I think Jessica did a very good job in, covering, all of it. I think soft skills are probably the next most important thing we would take a look at.
Okay. And if you do have any recommendations, Ikenna asks if you have any recommendations about books, podcasts, or blogs that students can follow that will help them learn about the industry. Please feel free to sort of share it in the chat box. If you think of something else later, I'll be happy to share it with anyone else. Surya, what would you say is the most challenging and most rewarding aspect of your job?
So most challenging, I would say it's very different being in more of a corporate setting than in a lab. And so some of that is just, there's an inherent difference in culture and pace. So there's a more of a financial emphasis, right, when you're working at a company versus when you're working in an academic lab, where you kind of have a little bit more freedom to kind of pursue your interests. There's an overall objective when you're working at a company. And so just adjusting your mindset to that, it takes a little while, just because you've been in research for so long, it sometimes can take a little while to get used to that mindset. Additionally, the pace is much, much faster. So deadlines are a few days, not maybe like 6 months or 8 months for a thing. Even for grants, when I was writing NIH grants, we usually spend a few months on those. Now it's much shorter. So I'd say the turnaround times are much quicker. The pace is much quicker, but you're still doing sort of the same amount of work.
Okay.
And that, yeah. And so I say the thing that's rewarding is one of the things that for me that was kind of bogging me down in the lab was I felt like I wasn't contributing enough into actually getting something from the lab to patients. And that's something that I get a chance to do now in my daily job of trying to find funding opportunities and getting money for these products so that they can move to patients quicker. So it is challenging for sure, but seeing that press release at the end that we got a funding opportunity and this is actually going to move through by in a few years, that's definitely rewarding.
Making an impact.
Right, making an impact.
And Jessica, what was the hardest transition going from academia to industry?
So part of this is, I'm going to call it ruthless prioritization. I agree. I had a little bit more of my own flexible schedule when I was in a postdoc. I was able to kind of set my own time. And I think just trying to balance out what I think the best direction for the company to go and what I think the most interesting questions are to ask, and trying to balance those out with what's best for the company has been something I've had to transition into. That's a different mindset for me that I had to pick up. So that definitely took a little bit extra time. But I do think that the best way to answer any question is to have all different kinds of minds from all different kinds of backgrounds. So there are definitely times where I've gone against something that someone, maybe it was a group held belief, most of the people on the team thought this, and I felt a different way. Speaking up in those instances is very important. It's hard and it's scary. And I definitely can attest that I haven't always said what I wanted to say out loud, and I've had to come back to it later and find a time to work it in. But being able to do that and really feel like when there's something that I feel passionate about and that I think is the right thing for us to do, being able to feel confident and strong enough to say those things is also very important. In academics, it's very easy to kind of sit on the sidelines and let the big names make all the big decisions. And so transitioning into the place where I actually, in my very first one-on-one meeting with my CEO, I remember the first thing I said to him was, I know I don't talk a lot in meetings, but I'm taking notes and I'm paying attention, and I promise once I find my voice, I'll use it. But I was very concerned that he thought I wasn't invested in the company enough because I wasn't the loudest voice in the room. And that's just a thing I had to learn, is to kind of like feel comfortable enough that I can say it right away instead of having to think about it a lot first. So that was a transition for me.
Right. And a lot of people right now are feeling the uncertainties of COVID. And I asked a COVID-related question about hiring. But there's a question from the audience saying, right now, because I can't work in the lab, I'm losing about 2 to 3 months of experience doing bench work. How is that going to affect my PhD application or my job application? How do you justify the loss of time and experience during this period? And Damini, would you have some insight about that?
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, it's a hard time irrespective of industry. And a lot of hands-on industries are getting affected, you know, irrespective of whether it's biotech, biomed, mechanical, aerospace. You know, if you do work that involves hardware or requiring a lab setup, you know, you're probably affected by this, you know, by the COVID situation in some way. And to that, I would say that, you know, use this time to learn something new, you know, add to your skill set, take an online course. You've never had this kind of free time on your hands before, right? So make the most of it. And you want to set yourself, so think of it this way: if you're facing this loss of time, there are probably thousands of others like you that are also facing this loss of time, which means that, you know, most recruiters are going to be cognizant of the fact. But what will help you set you apart is, what did you do with this time? How did you use it productively to either enhance your skill set or do something different or pursue a passion or a hobby that you haven't been able to do, you know, from a technical point of view, that you can do from sitting inside your house. So, you know, it ultimately boils down to what you make of your situation. So, you know, use the time effectively to do things that you can do remotely. And, you know, that'll shine then, because, you know, that tells the recruiter, and I do a lot of hiring for our company, that tells me that you are not sitting complacent, and, you know, you are not crying about the fact that you didn't have anything to do, but instead, you know, you went and tried to do something with your time, you know, and that sets you apart, because that tells me even as an employee, you'll be willing to take initiative and make the best out of you know, a bad situation.
I'd like to add to that as well. I think also it's on the other flip side of that. Not only are people understanding, I think it's okay to feel the way you're feeling right now. Everyone's feeling the uncertainty at every level, whether that's scientist level, director level, and CEO level. So I think being a little sort of gentle with ourselves during this period is okay as well, in addition to trying to brush up some skills as well. So I wanted to ask you, Surya, what do you foresee as the future of biotech? Where do we see the direction going in the next 5 to 10 years? What are some hot topics? And this is a question that someone submitted.
So one for sure is personalized medicine. I think a lot more treatments that are specific to individual patients. And I would say that from not only from sort of therapeutics or vaccines, but from a device side as well. And additionally, I think there's more of a broad spectrum sort of aspect that people are looking for in medical interventions as well. So traditionally, if you have so take COVID for an example, you're trying to develop a specific therapeutic or specific vaccine for COVID. But I think there's more, the field in general is moving for things that you can use for multiple different diseases, just because as pandemics happen or as more infectious disease outbreaks happen, you need something that you can quickly get out to patients. And so there's definitely an emphasis moving towards that sort of, they call them platform technologies or broad spectrum technologies. So I think that's where the field is slowly moving in that direction.
Okay. From what you guys have shared so far, I'm hearing a lot of start early, ask questions, go on informational interviews, reach out to people, ask for help, don't be afraid, learn how you can transfer your current skills that you're acquiring in your PhD, master's, and postdoc, learn how that can be transferred, and then tailor your CV, tailor your resume, right? What is one piece of advice you wish someone had shared with you before transitioning into industry? If you had one piece of advice, what would that be? Jessica?
The best advice that I got going into the process was that you should get a cheerleader. So transitioning from academics into industry, I needed someone who was willing to just be the voice in the background that's like, you're good enough, apply, or you won't know if you don't apply, or make the time to go to that talk. I needed someone to be that for me, and it actually helped me a lot. And so I paid it forward, and I did that to another postdoc that I knew, and I was her cheerleader. When I didn't hear from her about how a job interview went, I asked her, you know, like, just kind of, did you talk to those people? I knew you were gonna. And you know, just lift people up, you know. So if you have someone that you can put in your corner to help lift you up and to help encourage you to keep moving forward, that's the most help you can get. If you can put someone in your corner wherever your job is, it's been priceless to have someone like that at every stage in my career.
Okay. And Surya, any one piece of advice?
Yeah, I would say building along that, be confident in yourself. It's a long process and there are a lot of rejections, and you're going to get down on yourself sometimes because it seems like you don't have a good place to go. But it's all about finding a right fit with the right company. So it takes time, just be patient, but just never lose that confidence in yourself and you'll be okay.
Damini, you said you're hiring right now, or you've been on hiring teams as well. Someone asks in the audience, should I wait it out a bit during COVID situation? I'm a master's student and will be finishing up soon. Should I wait to apply for a job or go ahead and apply for it now?
Well, if you find a job that you really want to work with, you know, there's no harm in applying for it. The fact that that posting is out there is because there is a need. And so, you know, I don't see any disadvantage to, you know, applying. Always, you know, the final decision lies with you, whether you say yes or no. But, you know, if you're actively looking for jobs and you're finding positions that are hiring, then, you know, at least go ahead and put in an application. There's no harm in doing that.
Mm. And do you think that eventually the salary that you get, is that dependent on what your degree was and also level of degree?
That's a good question. To a certain extent, yes.
Mm.
But at the same time, I think it's very specific to, you know, what industry, what size of a company, where the company is located, you know, what the cost of living in the area is. There's a lot of compounding factors. So I don't think, you know, your salary is contingent only on one variable. It involves, you know, a whole host of things. And it also, I think, to a certain extent depends on the kind of company you're going into, you know, what does their compensation structure look like? And even within like an industry, geography, size of company, the compensation structure for core technical fields can vary quite a bit. So I think this is like a one-on-one conversation that, you know, you want to have with your company. And before going into that conversation, get as much information as you can. So, you know, reach out to friends, family, other people in your network to find out what those ranges should look like, and then see if you're being compensated fairly against those ranges.
Mm. Okay, there's an interesting question from Van who says, what can you do with a PhD, but not with a master's when you're in a biotech company? Does having a master's only make it harder to apply for, say, grants or funding? And Damini, this were questions for you.
That's a good question again. So I think the advantage that you have with a PhD that you don't with a master's is you can consider your time with a PhD as work experience as well. So, you know, if you're entering a company with a PhD, then, you know, on paper, you probably have a longer work ex because, you know, you've been doing active research, you've been involved with, you know, improving your technical skills, and you've been involved in, you know, some scientific space. So that qualifies as work ex. And I think that's the biggest advantage that you bring with you that, you know, a master's student doesn't have is, you know, that extended experience that they get, you know, in working with other people around them. Because typically with a master's program, you know, it's such a quick program. By the time you get started, you're done. And I think, you know, that's the biggest difference. And a lot of companies value that as well, you know, that additional experience that you're getting. And the reason I mention this is because a lot of people discount their PhD experience in the sense, you know, when you're asked to quote your total work experience, you don't count the amount of time you've spent, you know, doing research in a lab, working as a research assistant, working as a teaching assistant. All of those things count. So make sure you leverage that.
Okay. Okay, and then you had all mentioned, obviously networking was an important factor. What strategies do you suggest that folks do while they're at home to network effectively during a pandemic? And I suppose you touched upon that earlier as well, reach out to people on LinkedIn. What else do you suggest we can do in the meanwhile? Jessica?
Social hours. The biotech social hours are a huge thing where I work right now. They'll have biotech and beers and all those kinds of things. So I would say anytime that you can go and interact with people, and I know right now we can't all congregate together, but the social aspects of these multi-person Zooms or webinars where you can interact with people, I think that that gives you a lot of opportunity to make a real connection with people. And I mean, that's how I found my job, was through career fairs and things like that. So you have to have because there are so many applicants that come through electronically, having something that is a personal stamp of you on that piece of paper it just makes such a big difference. Having people be able to put a face to the name and a personality to the name can help you stand apart. So any opportunity to interact with people in that way, I think, is really useful. I've seen a lot of really great webinars of conferences right now because they're virtual. The price on these has gone down. You might be able to ask your PI if you could attend a couple of these virtual conferences that you might not have been able to attend because it was too far away or because it was too expensive. I'm at a conference right now, and I think it cost $75 for a week of being able to sit in on conversations, get emails for big names in the field, and look at posters. Posters are a really great way to make a direct connection with a lead author on one of those. So I think any opportunity that you can have to make that kind of a personal connection, that it's helpful.
Pritika asks, I think BioBuzz is a good resource for that as well, that post-industry updates or postings. Janita asks a question, industrial postdoc positions are becoming more prevalent recently. Is there a benefit to a position like that over a full-time entry position? Surya?
So I'm not sure how it is now, but when I was applying, people had told me that postdoc industry positions were a little bit more limited than something like you would do at a full-time entry position. I'm sure this is very dependent on the company that you join and the size of the company, so you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. But I would say, usually they would tell me usually you should apply for full-time entry if you qualify, and try to avoid industry postdocs. But like I said, that being said, you really have to check with the people at the company because it's going to be very, very company specific.
Right, and some companies will make you sign like a 3-year postdoc contract, and you have to do your entire length of postdoc within that industry company. But obviously there are advantages to doing it because you already have a foot in the door.
Right.
So like Surya said, I think it depends on what company and asking the questions of people who work in that company. Jessica, as a wrap up, I want to ask each one of you, and I'll start with Jessica, is what do you see as career growth for each of you next? What does your next steps look like within the biotech world? And I'll start with you.
So this COVID-inspired remote working has given me some space to actually get away and step back from the lab. And it's allowing me to kind of understand, I had defined myself by my lab skills. A lot of what I had done and what I thought I brought to the table were associated with that. And I'm discovering that there's a lot more to what I can bring to the team when I'm able to focus outside of that lab space. And so I see myself pulling back a little bit from the bench and challenging myself to find more of a leadership role and to try and lead biology from that perspective. So I'm very excited about the opportunity to move in that space.
And Damini, you're director of product development, what next for you? And what happens with the H-1B as well?
Right, so both are good questions. Let me address the H-1B question first. So the H-1B is valid initially for a period of 3 years, then you can get it extended for a period of another 3 years. After which, you have to think about, how do you want to transition? Either, as a permanent resident of the States, do you want to go back? And these are all questions that I'm thinking about, as I figure out what my future plan is. Obviously, my skill set that I've acquired through my work with IBT has been incredible in terms of, learning how a medtech company works. And now I'm trying to figure out how I can, potentially contribute to starting something of my own, be it in the States or, back in India.
And Surya, what do next steps look like and career growth and stuff like that?
Yeah, so far my career has been very science heavy. And so with my role now, the next phase of my development is to develop a better business sense. And so I'm working towards eventually getting an MBA in a few years. And so for that, I need some experience under my belt before I can start applying. But also moving to more of a manager level role as well. So I have more oversight over the strategic part of what we're doing as a company. And so that's sort of the next phase for me.
Okay. You know, I've always said that the hardest transition for anybody, or at least for me, has been from that PhD postdoc to the next step. And after that, feels like the world is your oyster. I suppose you telling me what your next steps are looks like anything's possible. Yes, Laura, I just mentioned in the chat that I will share their LinkedIn profiles in case you want to follow up. It's a lot of questions to fit in an hour, but I think we did really well because the panelists were excellent in answering the questions, the points. I just want to thank everybody. If you have any